I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule, they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. This happened in Warsaw County in 2008. After the school year ended, my friends and I went camping in the forest to sit around a campfire and tell scary stories. We mocked these stories, not suspecting that the night would bring something far more terrifying. We were sitting by the fire, tired of talking, when suddenly Marek shouted, "What the?" and jumped up, knocking over a bottle of water. Robert joked that Marek was scared of some bug, but then he fell silent. A sudden wave of horror washed over me and everyone else sitting around the small campfire. In complete silence, we stared at the object Marek had just pulled from the ground beneath his feet. It was a fragment of a human jawbone. His hand trembled, and he dropped the bone to the ground as if it were charged with terror, instantly transmitting that fear to all of us. The thought on everyone's face was clear. This can't be. The silence was broken only by the crackling of burning logs and the whisper of the wind in the treetops. Suddenly, we all jumped up and began clearing the area we had chosen for our camp. In the darkness of the night, our movements were jerky and nervous, like those of hunted animals. Without noticing anything around us, we started tearing up the grass and almost immediately stumbled upon human remains. The feeling that someone or something was watching us from the darkness grew stronger, and suddenly everyone started screaming. But each person was saying something different, so no one could hear anyone else. Our voices merged into a strange cacophony, as if the forest had come alive and was speaking with thousands of voices at once. Marta, standing opposite, grabbed her head, her voice lost in the general clamor. She tried to say something, but her words were drowned out by the noise. Meanwhile, Marek, holding his breath, continued to stare at the fragment of the human jawbone he had just pulled from the ground. His hand trembled, and he dropped the bone to the ground as if it were charged with terror, instantly transmitting that fear to all of us. Anna screamed that we needed to call the police, and we were ready to do so when Robert pointed to a piece of clothing sticking out of the ground. "That's a jacket like Marek's," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear and astonishment. Near the remains, sticking out of the ground, like the skeleton of a ship washed ashore, was the edge of a denim jacket, exactly like Marek's. Everyone silently looked at him, realizing that this was no coincidence. His jacket had been made by our friend Marta, who now stood opposite, watching in shock at what was happening. Marek's heart beat faster as he dared to pull at the edge of the deceased's jacket. He began cautiously, but the more the jacket unfolded before him, the more he realized it was an exact copy of his own. Our gazes now turned to Marta, expecting an explanation from her. Pale as death, Marta, clutching her hands to her chest and gasping for breath, stepped back, step by step. I didn't. Her words hung in the air like the echo of something terrible. She couldn't finish the sentence. But in the depths of each teenager's mind, her terrifying answer had already appeared. I didn't make 2 jackets. Suddenly, she tripped over a stone and fell, as if an invisible force wanted to stop her from revealing the truth. Tomasz approached to help her up, but when he pushed the stone, something about its shape seemed strange to him. The stone revealed a white, shiny surface. It was another bone. Despite the fear, we began to dig up the bones, and what we saw made our souls freeze in horror. Beneath the ground lay Marta's remains in the same clothes she was wearing now. Her face was unmistakably recognizable, though distorted by time and earth. We were seized by hysteria. Screams, cries, and despair mixed into an unbearable din. Marek, clutching his head, screamed, "This is impossible!" I, sobbing, repeated, "This can't be true." Tomasz, with eyes full of fear, rushed around mindlessly, seeking escape from this nightmare. But Robert, despite the panic, pulled himself together and loudly said that we should calm down and try to find a way out. His words sounded like the only ray of hope in this sea of horror. So, we quickly gathered our flashlights, leaving other gear behind, and hurried away from the campsite. The flashlights cut bright cones of light in the darkness, illuminating the path. The forest seemed even darker and more sinister, every shadow appearing alive and hostile. However, in our haste, we didn't notice that we had lost our way. Tree branches tangled in our hair, and roots tripped our feet. We ventured deeper into the forest, hoping to find an exit, but with each step, the sense of unease only grew stronger. The trees all looked the same, and the paths were confusing. A deep silence surrounded us, broken only by the whisper of the wind in the treetops and the distant song of birds. Each member of the group felt a slight tremor in the air, as if the forest was breathing with us, mysterious and alive. Finally, stopping to catch our breath, we realized we were lost. The forest seemed to close in around us, with strange sounds echoing from all sides, making us look back. Everything around was enveloped in an eerily mystical atmosphere that engulfed us more with each step. Tall, old trees with branches reaching for the sky created a natural dome, and we all felt trapped. Robert tried to calm everyone down, but there was tension in his voice. Fear flared up with renewed intensity. The forest seemed like an endless labyrinth, and our steps felt futile, leading nowhere. The feeling that we were not alone grew stronger in our minds. Suddenly, I felt something touch my shoulder and jumped back in fright. The beam of the flashlight fell on a nearby tree, revealing a horrifying sight. Terrified, I screamed and barely stayed on my feet from the shock. I turned to tell my friends, but instead of their faces, I saw a body hanging from the tree, crucified upside down. My eyes widened in horror as I recognized Tomasz. His face was pale, his eyes closed, and his mouth open as if he had screamed in his last moments. I screamed again, but my cry was drowned out by my own fear. I ran away from what I had seen, not even noticing that my friends had followed me. I didn't know where to run, but I knew I couldn't stay. We ran without stopping until we emerged into a field surrounded by tall grass. In the middle of the field stood a twisted tree with branches that looked like bony hands reaching for the sky. Suddenly, Tomasz remembered a story his grandfather had told him when he heard where his grandson was going. The story claimed that deep in the forest, there was a field where the ground looked scorched and dry, forming a perfect circle. In the center of this circle stood a crooked, dead tree that seemed to radiate sinister energy. According to legend, this place was associated with ancient rituals and magical ceremonies that had been performed there many centuries ago. His grandfather had warned Tomasz to avoid this place, but it was in vain. Now I didn't understand how we ended up here. We stood, breathless and frightened, when a tall, skeletal man appeared from the shadows. His face was grotesque and barely visible in the darkness. He beckoned us with a long, thin finger, a gesture that seemed both an invitation and a threat. But before we could react, he disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only a sense of unspeakable horror. We stood there, not knowing what to do next. Our hearts pounded wildly, and fear completely clouded our minds. What was that? Why was this happening to us? And most importantly, how could we escape this sinister place? The forest surrounded us like an impenetrable veil, and it seemed there was no way out. At that moment, Robert cursed loudly. Fear and helplessness clouded his eyes like a veil and weighed down his soul. So he followed the skeletal man, calling out to him and trying to lure him out to explain what was happening to us and what kind of devilry was going on around us. We all hurried after Robert, urging him to stop and not follow the stranger, saying we would find a way out without that creature. But in the forest, Robert suddenly stopped, and Anna bumped into his back and almost fell. She peeked over his shoulder and froze just like him. Trembling, we walked around them, and a horrifying scene unfolded before us. On the ground lay the bodies of Robert and Anna in an embrace, as if they had sought refuge in each other. The bodies were already decomposed, showing that they had been there for no more than a week. This sight evoked horror and disgust, causing Marta to vomit. We turned to the real Robert and Anna, but they were no longer there. We began to look around in fear, searching for the pair. But when we turned back to the bodies, we saw that now the real Robert and Anna lay dead on the ground in an embrace, blood flowing from both, soaking the earth and the roots of the trees. My heart froze with terror. I felt reality shattering into pieces, as if this forest was devouring my soul. Every step, every glance filled me with a new level of horror, but what I saw now broke the last remnants of hope for salvation. Suddenly, a frightened Tomasz raised a trembling hand and pointed at me. He noted that they had seen the bodies of everyone except mine. I saw everyone freeze, contemplating his words. They turned to Tomasz, and an unspeakable horror was reflected in his eyes. I felt the doubts of the others as they tried to decide what to believe. They dismissed the thought, claiming Tomasz was making things up out of fear and panic. But the atmosphere and the relentless facts he voiced began to convince Marek and Marta. They focused on me, trying to find something suspicious in my behavior. Gradually, the tension grew, and their accusations became more aggressive. My friends started shouting at me, their words filled with fear and rage. The atmosphere thickened with tension, and eventually they couldn't take it anymore and lunged at me. I tried to push them away, to shield myself from the blows, but it was futile. The hits were chaotic and brutal, driven by panic and despair. But I managed to break free from their grasp. My body burned with pain, but fear gave me strength. I dashed into the depths of the forest, leaving behind my former friends who were no longer themselves. They had turned into phantoms, horrifying visions that had lost their minds in this sinister forest. I ran without looking back, feeling my heart pounding in my chest like mad. I stumbled over tree roots, crawled through thick bushes, but didn't stop. The only thought was to find a safe place to hide. Finally, I found a small pit under an old tree. I fell into it, holding my breath and trying to calm down, to become as inconspicuous as possible. My body trembled with fear and pain, and only one question echoed in my mind. What is this terrible place, and how can I get out of here alive? Tomasz, Marek, and Marta remained standing, trying to decide what to do next. I watched as they hesitated in the middle of the forest path. Suddenly, Tomasz approached his friends and said something to them. Marek and Marta nodded, continuing to whisper. Tomasz went deeper into the forest, while they stayed behind, looking at each other. But Tomasz didn't return, so Marek and Marta started calling for him. Time passed, and he still didn't appear. Finally, they decided to go look for him. I cautiously began to follow them, hiding behind trees. They moved carefully, listening to every sound. The forest seemed even more sinister, every rustle of leaves reminding them of an unseen threat. Suddenly they froze, and I followed their gaze. They had found Marek. He stood with his back to them, motionless and silent. As they approached, a sense of something sinister and horrifying engulfed me. I suddenly felt as if someone else was present, someone invisible and terrifying. At that moment, Tomasz turned around, and at that moment, an invisible force slashed his face, revealing a ghastly wound. Crimson-black splatters flew from his face, and he barely whispered, "Run!" Before we could react, something abruptly dragged Tomasz into the depths of the forest. He disappeared, leaving behind only a sense of unspeakable horror. Marek and Marta stood stunned, and I seemed to feel their fear, or perhaps it was my own. I realized that this place was not just dangerous, it was alive, and it wanted their demise. I knew we had to flee, but where? I continued to watch Marta and Marek as they trudged through the forest, searching for an exit. They were utterly exhausted, and had no idea I was following them from behind the trees, fearfully clinging to the trunk. Exhausted from the horror and constant running, Marta and Marek stopped in a small clearing surrounded by dense underbrush. They walked to a large wooden log and sat on it, as if afraid to separate. Suddenly they looked up at the sky, seeking some solace in the starry night. I followed their gaze, and my heart froze with astonishment and fear. 2 moons shone in the sky. It was a sight so unusual and eerie that the reality around us seemed completely broken. Overwhelmed by a sense of inevitability, I couldn't hold back my tears. They streamed down my cheeks, mingling with fear and despair. I watched my friends, trying to find anything that could help us escape. And then I froze. I realized that Marek and Marta had been sitting in the same clearing they had arrived at, but this time it was empty, without any belongings. I stood still, understanding that this was the end. My mind refused to accept this reality, but all the evidence was right before my eyes. The forest that had engulfed them offered no way out. I felt an overwhelming fear and hopelessness take over my mind. This place would be their final resting spot, where each step brought them closer to an unknown, horrifying fate. I watched as shadows surrounded Marta and Marek. I stood motionless, my body paralyzed with fear. As the shadows approached my friends, I saw them become indistinct silhouettes in the darkness. Marta and Marek screamed, but their voices were quickly drowned out by a sound that resembled the whisper of the wind. Then I sat down on the ground by a tree and covered my ears, trying not to hear the terrifying screams of my friends. I clutched my head, trying to shut out the horror unfolding before me. Soon, as if under the weight of everything that had happened, I fell into a void. They found me a couple of days later, in the same spot, or so they told me afterward. I was hungry and dehydrated, utterly exhausted. My body remained weak for a long time, and my mind was clouded with despair. When the people who found me tried to learn what had happened, I struggled to recount the horrific events. Everyone just sympathized, thinking I had lost my mind a bit after witnessing my friends being kidnapped by the mafia. My stories about shadows and strange occurrences in the forest were dismissed as hallucinations caused by stress and hunger. Days dragged on slowly, and it seemed no one believed the truth I tried to convey. I returned home, but my mind remained trapped in those events. For a while, I sat motionless by my window, watching the forest. At night, I saw shadows flickering among the trees. I heard their voices, whispers calling me back. I understood that they hadn't disappeared. They would always be waiting for my return to the forest, and this knowledge gave me no peace. The shadows of the forest had become a permanent part of my life, haunting my deepest fears. We had been planning this trip for a long time. Right after the semester ended, our group of 5 set off on a journey to Romania, to the picturesque Vidraru Lake. Everyone was full of excitement and joy at the start of the vacation, and no one could have imagined that this trip would be the last for many of us. As we stepped out of our minivan, our eyes immediately caught sight of the abandoned lake, which spread out picturesquely before us in the shade of a dense, ancient forest. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in orange and pink hues that reflected on the water's surface, giving it a mystical and ominous appearance. The lake seemed like a mirror, except for the places where a light breeze created small ripples. Tall, slender trees grew along the shores of the lake, forming a dense barrier between the water and the forest thicket that began behind it. These trees, with their long shadows, cast patterns on the water that blended with the sunset light, creating an effect of shimmering colors and shapes. The occasional sounds of nature that broke the silence, the cries of birds, the rustling of leaves, the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush, all added to the atmosphere of mystery and abandonment of this place. We chose this spot for a reason. My fiancé Marcus and I wanted to celebrate our engagement. We decided to do it somewhere far from all problems, by the water, surrounded only by our closest friends. So we brought Leo, Maria, and Stefan with us. While we were all unpacking, Stefan looked at the smooth surface of the lake and said that it reminded him of a story he had heard from an old gas station attendant a few hours ago. The elderly man, with gray hair and wrinkles deeply etched into his face, spoke with a certain darkness and fear in his eyes about the past of this place. "This is no place for merrymaking, young man," he said, glancing over his shoulder, as if afraid someone might hear them. According to the old man, a witch once lived on that island long ago, known to everyone as the local healer named Ivanka. The villagers nearby respected her for her ability to cure diseases and make healing potions and ointments. However, when a poor harvest devastated the lands and disease struck the livestock, all the villagers' suspicions fell on Ivanka. They believed that her magic had brought this misfortune upon the village, as a price for playing with the laws of nature. The story ended in tragedy when one cold autumn evening, a mob of angry villagers stormed the island. They blamed Ivanka for all the misfortunes that had befallen them and decided to punish her in the most brutal way. According to the gas station attendant, They tied her up and threw her into the deepest part of the lake, where she drowned. Since then, no one dared to set foot on that island, and the lake began to be surrounded by a mystical aura. Although her body was submerged, the old man concluded, Ivanka's spirit continued to wander the island, causing the wind to whisper and a chill that penetrated to the bones. Sometimes you can hear her voice in the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. These last words echoed in my memory as Stefan finished his story, and I thoughtfully looked at the island, which seemed to glow in the rays of the setting sun. Everyone else took the story skeptically, and Leo added that he wouldn't mind having a drink with a pretty witch. So, despite the cold breath of the wind that reminded us of the invisible presence of the past, we loaded our things and headed to the small island that stood out in the middle of the lake. We launched 2 boats we found in the weeds by the shore and set off across the quiet, ominous waters. The twilight heightened the sense of anxiety, but the thrill of adventure and the forbidden gave us strength. Maria sat next to me, tightly gripping my hand. I could feel her heart beating in rhythm with the oars cutting through the water. The closer we got to the island, the stronger the feeling that this decision might have been a mistake. After setting up camp, the mood among the group lifted. The evening promised to be warm and cheerful. Marcus lit a large fire that crackled, illuminating the surrounding rocks and trees. We settled around the fire, pulling out a guitar and marshmallows for roasting. I began to sing soft, melodic songs, accompanied by Leo and Stefan on the guitar. Maria, always cheerful and energetic, shouted jokes and told funny stories, making everyone laugh. As time passed, we opened bottles of wine we had brought with us and began exchanging toasts to love, to adventure, to the future. Night slowly swallowed the day, and darkness enveloped the island with its soft but commanding embrace. The merriment continued, but with each tick of the clock, the night became more insistent and mysterious. At one point, Leo, feeling the need, decided to go to the bathroom and headed into the darkness of the island. When he returned after a while, we noticed he was carrying an old wooden box, battered and covered in moss, which must have been lying forgotten among the bushes. With curiosity and excitement, the guys opened it. Suddenly, Maria recoiled and gasped when she saw the contents. The box was filled with items that looked like tools for ancient potion making, dried herbs in pouches, glass bottles with incomprehensible labels, and parchments written in ancient script with recipes and strange diagrams. But among all this, one item stood out, a vintage ring with a crimson stone that sparkled even in the dim firelight. In this enchanting night atmosphere, where everything around was already cloaked in intriguing mystery, I didn't notice when Marcus took out the magical vintage ring. Under the flickering light of the fire and the starry sky, he pulled out the ring with the crimson stone, which glittered with sparks at every movement of the fire, and got down on one knee. All eyes were fixed on this ancient, unusual piece of jewelry. I gazed at it with fascination, but there was also a hint of concern in my eyes, due to the mystical aura surrounding our evening. Marcus gently took my hand, kissing my fingers tenderly. In his eyes, I saw love and warmth that made my heart flutter. He said that this ring should belong to me, but there was a note of mysterious fate in his words. When Marcus carefully slid the ring onto my finger, replacing the temporary engagement ring we had been using, I felt our bond grow even stronger. The kiss we shared was filled with love and affirmation of our feelings. But suddenly the air around us became cooler, and the wind seemed to whisper something elusive, almost unsettling. Was it just a coincidence, or perhaps a warning? The question remained open, though I tried to ignore it and returned to the celebration, dismissing that brief moment of unease. It was well past midnight when the celebration gradually quieted down, and everyone felt the fatigue after a long day. Friends began to notice strange sounds coming from the forest. Amidst laughter and jokes, Leo and Maria were the first to disappear. I noticed how Stefan had been observing their shy and interested glances all evening. He gave Leo the chance to make the first move and prove himself a true gentleman. Since their tent was designed for 3, Stefan decided to take a walk along the shore to give them some space before returning for the night. Marcus and I were the last to head to our tent. He, like a true fiancé, scooped me up in his arms, and disappeared with me into our shelter. Drifting into sleep, I suddenly woke up to a piercing scream that shattered the night silence. My heart instantly pounded in my chest, and I jumped up, not understanding what was happening. The scream came from the direction of the lake, and something cold and sticky slowly crept into my heart. I hastily grabbed a flashlight and ran out of the tent where Leo and Maria were already standing, both nervous and alert. Without a word, we ran to the shore where the screams continued to cut through the night. In the darkness that enveloped us, every sound seemed threatening, and every movement a harbinger of something terrible. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and I had to make an effort to keep the beam steady on the path ahead of us. When we finally reached the shore, a wave of horror washed over me. Leo stood knee-deep in the water, desperately trying to turn over Stefan's body, which floated in the dark, almost still water. The screams that tore from his chest sounded desperate and hopeless. Stefan didn't move. His body seemed unnaturally heavy, and his face unnaturally calm. Marcus rushed to Leo, helping to pull Stefan onto the shore. I stood aside, feeling fear grip every cell of my body, paralyzing me. Maria was also nearby, and we both held flashlights, illuminating scenes too eerie to be perceived as reality. The guys did everything they could to save Stefan, trying to expel the water from his lungs, administering first aid, but nothing worked. Every attempt was futile, and the silence that surrounded us only emphasized the hopelessness of the situation. I felt the darkness around us growing heavier, almost suffocating. It was as if the night itself was against us, watching our futile efforts with cold indifference. Horror and helplessness grew, consuming me entirely. I couldn't take my eyes off Stefan, whose body lay on the sand, motionless and cold. It felt like a sinister warning from which there was no escape. And in that moment, as I stood there illuminating this nightmarish scene, I felt a wave of cold, almost primal fear pierce me, sensing that something invisible and unspeakably terrifying was approaching us from the darkness, threatening to engulf us all. Despair and shock gripped us all as I watched Marcus's futile attempts to save Stefan. His hands, usually so strong and confident, now trembled with tension, and a shadow of hopelessness gradually appeared on his face. Each new attempt seemed even more futile, and with every passing minute, my hope faded, dissolving into the night air, which suddenly became heavy and suffocating. I stood next to Maria, feeling her cold hands clutching mine. We couldn't find words to describe the horror that engulfed us. The sense of unreality mixed with growing fear, slowly but surely penetrating every corner of my consciousness. The forest, which had seemed like a peaceful refuge just moments ago, now enveloped us in a heavy silence, hiding some unknown threat. And suddenly, like from a nightmare, we heard a woman's laughter. It was light, almost playful, but cold, like an icy breath touching my skin. Marcus raised his head, quickly turning the flashlight towards the sound, and for a moment, I saw her, the same girl we had met earlier on the shore. Her figure, unreal and shimmering, stood among the trees, her black hair gently swaying in the air, and then she disappeared, dissolving into the darkness like a ghost. Panic seized us all, and without words, we rushed to the spot where we had left the boats. But what awaited us there only intensified our horror. The boats were gone, leaving us without any hope of escape. The lake was quiet, but in that silence lurked something sinister, something that made my heart beat faster, and cold sweat covered my body. We stood by the water, confused and scared. Marcus tried to pull himself together, to calm us down, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. He was the only one trying to find a way out of this trap, but even he began to lose confidence. I felt fear gradually consuming us all, tightening its cold grip. We gathered around the fire, which was almost out, seeking comfort in its last warm sparks. But even this fire seemed powerless against the darkness that surrounded us from all sides, and the laughter, it echoed again, somewhere in the darkness, making us shudder with fear, feeling helpless and cornered. When the fear reached its peak, Marcus decided to act. He suggested searching the island for another way to escape, and we agreed, though each step was filled with fear and uncertainty. We moved forward, but it felt like the shadow of imminent danger was following us, stalking us like a wild beast, waiting for its prey. When everyone set off into the forest to find a way out, I decided to stay by the fire. The shock and despair from losing Stefan still hadn't released me, and I couldn't force myself to take a single step. Thoughts swirled in my head, but the only clear thing was the desperate desire to survive. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, I stared into the flickering sparks among the ashes, hoping to find some comfort, some hint of safety. But the shadows dancing around grew more sinister with each passing second, as if the darkness was trying to engulf me, to drag me into its cold, soulless embrace. Marcus, Leo, and Maria decided to venture into the dense forest, hoping to find another path to the shore. I watched as they split up. Maria headed north, barely illuminating her way with a small flashlight that seemed almost powerless in such darkness. Her figure quickly disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my thoughts. She had always been determined and eager to be helpful, but something about this situation filled me with an overwhelming fear. The forest around us grew increasingly ominous. It seemed that the trees themselves harbored something malevolent, and I involuntarily shuddered at every rustle of leaves or gust of wind. I tried to distract myself from the terrifying thoughts, but couldn't shake the feeling that Maria would encounter something dreadful, and this feeling was confirmed when I heard a muffled scream, lost in the rustling of the forest. My heart clenched with fear, and my mind stubbornly tried to convince me that everything was fine, that it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. But fear gradually consumed me, and I knew that scream couldn't have been just my imagination. Some time passed, and when Maria didn't return to the fire, Marcus and Leo went to look for her. I was left alone, feeling fear closing in on me from all sides like a heavy shroud. Their desperate cry when they found her body shattered the eerie silence, and my soul seemed to collapse into an abyss. I knew my friend was dead. Her absence, Marcus's scream, the silence that followed, all convinced me of one thing: we were trapped, and death was stalking us. After Maria's death, Marcus and Leo decided not to separate anymore. They moved together like two ghosts wandering through the night forest, trying to find any hope of rescue. I stayed by the fire, feeling how this forest was gradually becoming more hostile and unwelcoming. Fatigue and fear consumed me, but I knew I had to stay strong, even if my strength was waning. The fire was dying down, and my mind was filled with thoughts of whether we would ever get out of here alive. I remained by the fire, feeling fear gradually tightening its grip on me from within. Every new gust of wind seemed like a voice whispering to me about the inevitability of something terrible. The forest around us grew increasingly sinister, shrouded in mist, and when Marcus returned to check on me and said he had found a narrow path between the rocks, I already knew it wouldn't lead to salvation, but none of us could sit idly by, and he decided to explore the path first. So I watched as he disappeared into the thick fog and almost immediately felt something clutching at my heart. He quickly vanished from sight, and even the sound of his footsteps dissolved into the dense grayness that enveloped us. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a scream that pierced me like a needle. It was Marcus. His voice was filled with pain and despair, and the worst part was that I couldn't do anything. I rushed in that direction, but my legs seemed to refuse to obey. The fog grew even thicker, and I couldn't see even my hands in front of me. Every step felt like a step into an abyss. When Leo returned, he was alone. His face was deathly pale, and tears stood in his eyes. I couldn't believe that Marcus was dead. Something inside me refused to accept it. It seemed like a terrible mistake, that Leo just couldn't find him, that he was alive, that I could still help him. But Leo only shook his head sadly, and I realized there was no hope. I collapsed to the ground like a broken doll, overwhelmed with grief. My hands trembled as I hugged myself, trying to protect myself from the cold that pierced me, not only from the outside, but also from within. I whispered Marcus's name like a prayer, trying to bring him back to life with my pain, my despair. But there was only silence and the fog that swallowed everything. When Leo said he would try to swim to the shore and call for help, I knew I couldn't hold him back any longer. He explained his plan to me, but his words sounded like a distant whisper in my ears. My heart clenched with fear and despair, and each beat grew louder, like a countdown to something terrible. I felt that he might not return either, that this island wouldn't let us go so easily. I watched as Leo entered the cold water, trying to remember every detail as if it were our last meeting. He was a good swimmer, and I saw him quickly disappear into the watery mist, but the sense of hopelessness only grew stronger. The night was quiet, too quiet, and this silence became my worst nightmare. I knew I was alone, but I couldn't force myself to look away from the spot where Leo had disappeared, because something inside me still hoped for a miracle. But there were no miracles here, only fear and darkness. The water around me was as black as the night, and the air was thick with anxiety. As Leo began to swim, I stood on the shore, feeling all my strength leaving me with each of his movements in the water. I kept my eyes on him, trying not to succumb to the fear that he might not return. But with each wave, this fear grew. It seemed as if the minutes stretched into eternity. My heart pounded, and my mind imagined the worst scenarios. And then, he was no longer visible. The fog, which suddenly thickened, swallowed him, and my heart clenched with horror. I felt the cold seeping into my bones, not even realizing whether it was from the night or the very thought that he wouldn't return. Silence fell like a heavy stone, and only my breathing disturbed this eerie stillness. But the silence was deceptive. When I heard the rustle of sand behind me, my heart seemed to stop. Turning around, I saw her, the creature so many legends spoke of. Her face was unnaturally white, and her eyes cold and bottomless, like the gaze of death itself. I felt fear paralyze my body. My mind was blank, and the only thing left was the ghostly feeling that life was about to end. She didn't speak, just silently stared at me, and in her gaze, I saw the depth of darkness. I don't even remember how I took off that cursed ring and threw it at her feet. My movements were automatic, as if I wasn't controlling them. When she disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared, I was left alone. But with each moment, the anxiety only grew because the night didn't want to let me go. And then I saw the boat. It seemed like my only chance for salvation. But as I climbed into it, I didn't feel relief, only a heaviness, as if something invisible was pressing on my shoulders, making me think this wasn't the end. I sat in the boat, watching the island gradually disappear into the mist, and felt the invisible force that had held me here since our arrival finally release me. But even then, when the island was out of sight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had stayed with me, something dark and inexplicable that was now a part of me. At the end of September, when autumn had fully taken hold, painting the Postojna forest in fiery hues, I finally convinced my friends to go on our annual camping trip. We left the car by the side of the main road leading into the forest, and, after walking a bit further, came across an old, moss-covered sign. The engraved letters on the darkened wooden background silently told us that this forest had been the site of bloody battles during the Austro-Hungarian War with the Ottoman Empire. The wind barely rustled through the fallen leaves, creating a sense of the past's presence, which seemed to still linger in these places. The sunset transformed the forest into something incomprehensibly enchanting and simultaneously frightening. The light became soft and warm, as if the last rays of the day were trying to cheer us up. But with each passing minute, the forest seemed deeper and more mysterious. The leaves on the trees were painted in crimson and golden shades, and the light mixed with the mist rising from the ground, adding an effect of an old, faded photograph to the surrounding landscape. It even seemed to me that we were diving into the past, preparing for another escape into one of Croatia's most mysterious forests. By the time we reached our campsite, the forest was completely shrouded in darkness. The beams of our flashlights cut through the darkness, but it seemed to retreat only slightly, hiding behind the trees, illuminating the intricate web of branches and leaves that desperately clung to life in the cold autumn air. We set up our camp in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees that seemed to watch our every move, silently waiting to see what would happen next. The night brought deep shadows that completely engulfed the clearing, leaving only the campfire as the sole source of light and warmth. I decided to add more wood to the fire and stood up, feeling the cold breeze run across my skin. As I moved away from the fire, the darkness immediately swallowed me, as if gladly welcoming me into its embrace. The beams of our flashlights couldn't fully penetrate this darkness, and I felt something tighten inside me. A sudden sense of danger emerged in my mind. And then I saw them, a pair of bright eyes glowing in the darkness nearby, staring directly at me. For a moment, I thought it might be a reflection from a tourist's flashlight or some metal object forgotten in the forest, but the eyes didn't disappear. They remained in place, watching me intently. My heart began to beat faster. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that it was easy to be mistaken in the dark. But when I returned to the fire with the wood, I saw those same eyes again, and this time there were more of them. They glowed from different directions, as if surrounding me from all sides. It seemed that each pair of eyes was silently observing my every move, silently evaluating me. My anxiety turned into panic. I tried to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't let go. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, and my heart was beating somewhere in my throat. Each new pair of eyes that appeared from different corners of the forest seemed closer, more insistent. Their bright light pierced the darkness, and I could no longer look away. My body froze in terror. What were they? Animals? People? Something else? I didn't know, but I felt something cold and sinister slowly creeping towards us. When I finally sat back down by the fire, it seemed that its warmth could no longer chase away the cold that had crept into me. I realized that this forest hid something dark and ancient, something that had been waiting for us that night, and now I wasn't sure we could get out of here alive. When I felt those strange gazes on me, it became clear that it wasn't just my fear, but something much deeper. The feeling that this forest held memories of past horrors intensified. It seemed that each of those gazes belonged to those who had once fallen here in battle, their souls now wandering among the old trees, unable to find peace. I couldn't bring myself to involve the others in this sinister vision. Slowly, trying not to reveal my fear, I began to retreat back to the camp, feeling those eyes following me with each step. It was the feeling of something ancient that still hadn't found its retribution. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that it was all a play of light and shadow. But the more eyes appeared, the brighter and more real they became. These weren't just reflections. They were something alive and inevitable. The light they emitted was cold and unfamiliar, not something that could belong to the animals of this forest. When I returned to the camp with the flashlight in hand, Ivo, one of my friends, spoke up fearfully, admitting that he had also seen those eyes watching us from the darkness. Then the others confessed that they had noticed them too, scattered among the trees. The atmosphere among us became incredibly tense. We huddled closer together, seeking protection in this eerie forest. The realization that something invisible was watching us gradually turned into unspeakable horror. We were part of something ancient and mystical, and it made our hearts beat even faster. We huddled around the campfire, gripped by a shared sense of anxiety. Fear paralyzed our bodies. We were afraid to move, and every sound in the darkness became a threat. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night, but its light seemed too weak to protect us from the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, Miran, one of our friends, slowly stood up. His eyes were wide open, but there was no awareness in them, as if he had fallen under the influence of some incomprehensible force. He silently walked to the edge of the clearing and disappeared into the forest's darkness. We all called for him to come back, but he didn't respond, continuing to walk forward as if under the command of some invisible force. The horror I felt at that moment was unbearable, as if I were watching something irreversible, something we couldn't stop. When Moran disappeared from sight, the silence was suddenly shattered by a wild scream, deep and terrifying, piercing the air and making me shudder. My heart pounded even faster, fear intensified to the limit, creeping into every cell of my body. I stood paralyzed by the sound, and at that moment, a faint glow appeared in the forest, like a pale light flickering between the trees. It lingered for a few minutes before suddenly fading, leaving me surrounded by thick darkness and silent mystery. The rest of us stood frozen, as if petrified, under the weight of the silence that filled the air with a heavy, suffocating uncertainty. We felt powerless, lost in the face of this invisible, mysterious threat that seemed to press down on us with every breath. The night stretched into infinity, and the darkness around us seemed alive, almost tangible, as it swallowed every beam of light from our dying fire. Our hearts beat in a wild rhythm of fear, every whisper of the wind or rustle of leaves conjuring irrational images of hidden enemies lurking in the darkness. We could only hope that dawn would bring us answers, or at least return Miran, who had vanished among the eerie shadows of the night. In the sleepless night, burdened with anticipation, every moment felt like an eternity, and the slightest sound in the forest triggered a sharp sense of anxiety. We huddled together, trying to find comfort in each other's presence, shuddering at every unexpected rustle or movement in the darkness, which seemed to draw its shadows ever closer to our refuge. But the horrors of that night didn't end. After a few minutes of tense waiting, Anna, our friend, suddenly stood up. Her eyes, like Miran's, reflected the same vacant look, as if she were being controlled by some invisible force pulling her into the deep darkness of the forest. Emma and I reacted instantly, rushing to her and grabbing her hands tightly. We tried to hold her back, but Anna looked at us with a strange aggression in her eyes, which no longer seemed to belong to her. Her face twisted with anger, and suddenly she bit into Ivo's hand. His scream pierced the air, but it didn't stop her. Anna broke free and ran into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. A moment after she vanished, a new scream echoed, a high-pitched female scream, even more terrifying because of its desperate, frantic tone. Ivo, clutching his hand where deep bite marks remained, turned to us, his face pale with pain and shock. We quickly treated the wound, but as we analyzed the events of the last few minutes, we realized a terrifying truth. Every time one of us stared too long at those mysterious eyes in the darkness, they lost control of themselves, as if falling under a hypnotic spell. This realization brought a new level of fear. We began to move with greater caution, trying to avoid any direct eye contact with those glowing spots that still flickered among the trees. We understood that dawn was still far off, and the night had only just begun. That night, as the thick darkness enveloped the forest, the starless sky was almost black, and the absence of the moon only heightened the oppressive atmosphere. The trees stood like black silhouettes against the dim sky, their branches swaying in the wind, creating a barely audible whisper that only intensified the anxiety. And in this setting, we were left alone with our fears, trying to survive that dreadful night. As Ivo began to suffer from sharp pain and increasing weakness, I felt his condition rapidly deteriorate. His breathing became more labored, his skin took on an unhealthy gray hue, and with each passing hour, he became less and less like himself. Emma and I took turns watching over him, keeping the fire going and trying to keep him conscious, but the night swallowed everything around us like a black hole. Soon, Ivo began to rave, his words blurred with reality. He spoke of eyes watching him from the darkness, of voices calling to him. The forest seemed alive, the gazes of invisible beings pressing on us from all sides, like invisible weights threatening to crush our souls. We felt that every rustle of leaves, every whisper was not just the wind, but something more, something dark and elusive, watching us from the darkness. We sat in silence when Ivo suddenly changed. His breathing became erratic and weak. His skin took on an unhealthy gray hue. He began to speak incoherently, as if in another, long-forgotten language. His words became less and less coherent until he fell silent. Ivo's last breath escaped as the first weak rays of dawn began to pierce through the tree branches. It was an end so sudden and unjustified that we couldn't believe what had happened. We huddled together, sitting in a circle by the fire, filled with horror and despair from the unknown and the fear of what this night might still bring. Despair and fear overwhelmed us as we realized that our camping trip had turned into a struggle for survival. We held each other tightly, waiting for the morning, ready for the trials of this night to continue. Emma and I found relative comfort in each other's silence. We sat close by the fire, which was smoldering at dawn, focusing our gazes on each other, avoiding the terrifying eyes that emerged from the shadows of the night. The weak rays of the sun painted golden highlights on our faces, giving the moment an almost sacred calm. But this silence didn't last long. Suddenly, Emma shuddered, her gaze directed somewhere to the side, and a look of concern appeared in her eyes. Worried by her reaction, I turned, but saw only darkness through which nothing was visible, only cold gazes. When I looked back at Anna, she stood up as if invisible forces were lifting her. I immediately jumped up and reached out to grab and hold her, but she, as if in a trance, walked away from the fire, her steps leading her straight to the dark heart of the forest. I rushed after her but stopped when Emma turned to me with a pale face, expressing a strange mix of fear and calm. Her gaze seemed to say goodbye to me, asking me not to follow her. And then, as if hitting an invisible wall, I stopped, watching Emma's figure blend with the mystical mists of the forest. In a moment, she was gone, leaving only the faint whisper of the wind as her message. Standing in the clearing, I felt despair and hopelessness engulf me with every breath. I screamed into the void, my voice echoing among the old trees, wishing for this nightmarish vision to end. I was ready to surrender to the elusive forces that had chosen us this dreadful night. However, as the sun rose higher, pushing the darkness into the background, the mystical light of day enveloped the forest, and all the mysterious eyes that surrounded us disappeared along with the shadows of the night. My search turned into a nightmarish journey through the forest I once considered a place of peace and rest. Walking among the trees, which now seemed like silent witnesses to the tragedy, I came across horrific scenes. The bodies of my friends were scattered in different corners of the forest. Each discovery was worse than the last. The bodies were brutally mutilated, with faces twisted in expressions of absolute horror and pain. When I found Ivo's body, scattered under a cover of moss and fallen leaves, it was almost unrecognizable. The body was covered with numerous cuts and marks that resembled scratches. I recognized him only by the remnants of his clothes, and it felt like a blow to the heart. It seemed that some invisible and cruel force was trying to reach something inside each of us. The fear that gripped me with each discovery mixed with a sense of absolute helplessness and bitterness. I remembered how we laughed and joked together, how I was going to tell Ivo about new plans. Now all of that was destroyed, turned into shattered dreams and unspeakable horror. When I came across the last body, Emma's, lying under an oak tree, my heart barely held on. She lay with her eyes open, looking at the sky as if trying to find an answer or salvation that never came. Her expression was filled with terror, and I felt a part of me break along with her last breath. Sitting on the ground next to her final resting place, I realized I was completely alone in this forest, which now seemed foreign and hostile to me. All our plans, hopes, and dreams of adventures with friends dissolved into silence and emptiness. This forest, which was once a place of peace, was now the site of our worst fear, and I knew this nightmare would stay with me forever. Overwhelmed with pain and loss, I fell to my knees. What was supposed to be a simple trip with friends had turned into a tragedy that forever changed my life. I didn't know if I could ever return to normal life, if I could ever forget the faces of my friends in their last moments. After the horrific discoveries in the forest, I felt an obligation to give my friends a proper burial. I found a camping shovel among the remnants of our camp and began the hard and exhausting work. Each movement of the shovel was a painful reminder of what I had lost. I hoped to honor their lives and deaths by providing a final resting place among the sinister trees that had witnessed our last night. After finishing the burials, I quickly gathered my things and found the car keys that belonged to Emma. I hurried to leave this place, wanting to escape the horrors that surrounded me as quickly as possible. I reached the spot where we had left the car, and before getting behind the wheel, I felt the need to take one last look at the forest, which now lost its mystery in the light of the morning sun. My gaze lingered on the tall, dark figures standing at the edge of the forest. Alongside the huge figures were countless smaller ones, resembling people. There were so many of them that my eyes couldn't take in all their silhouettes. Suddenly, one of the smaller figures waved at me in a way that Anna often did. This moment became the horrifying final note of our dreadful adventure. My body shivered with cold, and I quickly jumped into the car, started the engine, and sped away, not looking back at the place that had forever etched itself into my soul as a deep wound, incapable of healing. The journey home was quiet and heavy. With each mile that distanced me from the forest, I felt despair and emptiness fill my being. Although I managed to escape this nightmare, my soul remained in the forest, entangled among the shadows and mysteries of that night. That night irreversibly changed me, leaving marks that could never be erased from my memory. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.